I'm going to start this video with an apology for not having a reading summary video for 2 months. I've been extremely busy because that was Michaelmas term time for me, so I haven't been able to read much. It's not necessarily due to like the fact that I really have so little time to read, but it's because my course has like a lot of reading material. So when you're like reading stuff 24/7 for your course and being around in the reading material, when you try to do extra reading, it's just very straining my brain. So I've been reading, but just like by bits and really slowly. So what this video is going to be is a conglomeration of October and November, and yeah, I'm releasing it late into almost the middle of December. Anyways, I will try to read more in the holidays, and let's get started with the video. The first book I'm going to discuss is a collection of essays by Walter Benjamin, and this entire collection is named after his very famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So basically this talks about the concept of art or originality or authenticity, how it has evolved with the advent of mass production, starting from that of photography as a most discussed and prominent form of mass production of images. So in the beginning we have here and now of the original constitute the abstract idea of its genuineness. But in the case of in relation to manual reproduction, the genuine article keeps its full authority. In relation to reproduction by technological means, that is not the case. A technological reproduction is more autonomous relative to the original, and this is why through photography we can bring out aspects of the original that can be accessed only by the lens and not by the human eye. This is how kind of photography infringes on originally our relationship with the artwork, and the original kind of loses its authority because when you use photography you're able to access kind of like a new aspect, new perspective, and that kind of goes beyond the original. Another effect of photography is this. Art felt a crisis and it reacted with the theory of la pour art, a negative theology in the form of the idea of a pure art that rejected not only any kind of social function but also any prompting by an actual subject. So before then, maybe before the advent of the 20th century or the late 19th century, most art had a sort of actual function, whether it's like a portrait commissioned by nobility or a religious object. But then with mechanical reproduction, all those functions, they can be fulfilled by, well, mechanical reproduction. So art needs to really insulate itself from that. And that is why they have art for the art, where art is just pure art without any function. And if it has a function, it seems a bit of, the idea is that it's a bit diluted. Another really important idea is that shifts in like the quantity of art produced or like mechanical reproductions of art, whatever, doesn't just represent a quantitative shift, but also kind of like a qualitative shift of how art is and our relationship with art. So he says, displayability increases so enormously that the quantitative shift between its two pole switches as in primeval times to become a qualitative change of nature. And he gives an example of how this happens, let's say, in film. Just as enlargement is not really concerned with simply clarifying what we glimpse anyway, but rather brings out totally new structural formations in matter, neither does the slow motion technique simply bring out familiar movement motifs but reveals in them others that are quite unfamiliar and that bear no resemblance to decelerations of rapid movements but are like strangely gliding, floating, supernatural ones. How I understood that is that, you know, like the film lenses, how the camera's framed, close-ups, mid-shots and all sorts of things and slow motions and stuff, it's shaping the way that we view reality because we are unable to experience reality that way actually with our eyes. So that kind of really opens up a whole new window of experience for us. The next work that I read in this book is called Franz Kafka on the 10th anniversary of his death. I came across this essay at such good timing, it wasn't intentional, but I read it alongside the time when I was reading Franz Kafka's short fiction collection. Mainly it's like a discussion of his style and a lot of the central themes in them. So basically here he writes, for Kafka the world of officialdom and the paternal world are similar, both comprising of impassiveness, decrepitude and filth. So this is really relevant to one of the stories I discussed in my September reading, which I also give a link here. The story is called The Judgment, which basically deals with Kafka's problematic relationship with his father, and yeah, he thinks it is, this paternal thing is really similar to kind of like bureaucracy. Moreover, what is noted in this quote, he never pours his all into what can be deciphered. On the contrary, he took every conceivable precaution against having his text interpreted. I think this is a good summary of how like his work is being interpreted or like ought to be interpreted, because his work does reject interpretation. There's really two extremes you could go with it. So you could analyze like every single symbolism and you could do it with a lot of richness to you, like really a myriad of interpretations that go all the way from one extreme to the other, or you could simply take things at face value. And the latter approach is rather interesting in the sense that it brings out the sense that the human life is actually much more meaningless than we tend to acknowledge or realize, and hence, Benjamin writes, he robs human gesture of its traditional props and then possesses in it an object prompting unending reflections. Okay, the last short essay in the book is called Picturing Proust. Basically, this is on the author Marcel Proust, and he's definitely one of my favorite writers. Mainly due to like the beauty and the fluidity of his language, and also his interesting treatment of memory and time, which provokes a lot of philosophical considerations. So firstly, I think this quote is really significant and basically summarizes his book. So it says, Proust did not in his work describe a life as it had been, but a life as the person who had lived it remembered that life. The chief role was played not by what he experienced, but by the weaving together of his memories. So this draws out the difference between life itself being viewed objectively as it is and the subjective experience, and it is the latter that Proust portrays. And in fact, it is always the latter that we live, even though most literature don't tend to present life in the latter. I also found this particularly true of experience. All event experience is finally closed, at least in the one's view of experience, an event remembered is limitless, being simply a key to all that came before and all that came after it. Remembering that dictates the strict weaving pattern here. Unity of the text stems solely from the actus purus of remembering, not from the person of the author, and certainly not from the plot. There's also one significant thing that Benjamin has noted that I've also similarly noticed when I was reading Proust's work. That is the vegetative existence of Proust's characters, who are tied in so permanent a fashion to the place where they are found in society. And those characters always seem to be really associated to a certain place. And I think it's just a psychological thing that we tend to remember people and events in a form that they're inevitably tied to some sort of anchor, and that anchor is being the place where they lived at or where we spent the most memorable memories with them. Now, let's move on to Franz Kafka's short stories. Basically, I did mention this in my September video, but this is just a wrap up on the rest of the stories that I've finished. The first one I'm going to talk about is called The Stoker. It's a really interesting story, quite revealing of a number of things I'm going to mention here. So firstly, class. So the stoker on the ship in the story is a lower class worker who's clearly had little education, is very poor at articulating his misgivings and presenting a convincing argument that he wants to present against his manager. Carl, our protagonist, is a well-educated, middle-class young man who attempts to help the stoker raise the issue of his mistreatment up to the management level. However, due to the stoker's inability to present his case well, and just a number of impediments and complexities involving many other middle upper-class people who came in, this kind of attempt to raise his misgiving kind of fails. One of the main reasons of the failing is Carl's reunion with his uncle, who clearly sides with the management because they're connections or friends, I'm not sure if I remember, with the ship's kind of captain or whatever other management people. And this sharply draws a line between Carl's position and the stoker's position because it makes it difficult for him to side resolutely with the stoker. So there's this undividable line of class interests. It's just by nature, if you're born into a higher class or a lower class, it makes it really difficult for you to side with the other class because all of your identity and life and connections and everything is in your class. And the second is the ambiguity of administrating justice. So initially seems as if, from personally me, the reader's perspective, the stoker definitely has the justice on his side because he's being mistreated. However, after hearing other sides of the story, clearly by more articulate middle-class people, it becomes more and more ambiguous, even to me as a reader, whether the stoker really suffered injustice because he's just unable to articulate his case. And this poses a question, and this is a very prominent question in a lot of Kafka's works, that the question of administrating legal justice. So whether justice can really be served in courts, if a lot of the results of the trial really depends on how good a lawyer you have, how articulate they are, And just a side note, this the fairness of administrating justice and equality and how that relates to legal representation is kind of one of the topics for my extended essay for political philosophy that I'm doing this year. So yeah, by the end of Lent term, when I finish my 2 extended essays, I might want to talk about it on my channel because I felt it'd just be interesting to share. Next story is Metamorphosis, arguably, yes, definitely one of his most famous stories. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. What really struck me first is how ordinary his metamorphosis into a cockroach seemed from Gregor's perspective. And this bears a huge contrast to the horror of his entire family when they first saw him. It turns out when he first realized that he turned into a cockroach, his first concern was oh my god, it's 7. Oh, the lights are out. Oh my gosh, it's 7:30 and I need to go to work and stuff. And it is quite unsettling in the sense that he's so calmly contemplating that absurd situation whilst his entire mind is just fixated on going to work, and it is a very counterintuitive response in the eyes of like most ordinary people. So basically he knows like the chief clerk of his workplace is going to visit his family if he does not show up to work, and he has never missed a day of work, and he also knows that missing work is like inexcusable without very legitimate excuses. But in the context of the story, there seems like there really aren't any excuses that seem legitimate, and so he's also very acutely aware that workers in his company are not treated like human beings, yet he is completely entrapped in the company's manipulations all the while. Like he acknowledges, were all the employees without exception scoundrels? Were there really no loyal and dependable individuals among them who, if once a couple of morning hours were not exploited for work, were driven so demented by pangs of conscience that they were unable to get out of bed? This comment is kind of in line with Kafka's highly critical position against the bureaucracy. It is a system that does not care about the clerks as persons, yet it could also be understood as something that engulfs their entire personhoods and turning them just into like insignificant cogs in the system. Yet what is equally significant is kind of his a bit iffy, lukewarm relationship with his family, because after they realize that he's turned into a cockroach, they think none of them wanted Gregor to starve, but maybe they didn't want to confront so much the material detail of him eating anything. It seems that in all of his human relationships, whether it be work or be family, they are strongly bound by a sense of like duty and conscience to complete that duty rather than real affection. So he's tormented by his conscience for not being able to work and subsequently for failing to support his family and being a burden to them. Correspondingly, his family only feels a sense of like obligation and guilt, and just maybe they feel quite sorry for him, but no sense of affection in like feeding him and keeping him there. I think he is such an epitomic representation of the sad position of the modern man, only valued for his worth and his role, but not necessarily as in himself. They had just become used to it, both the family and Gregor. They gratefully took receipt of his money, which he willingly handed over, but there was no longer any particular warmth about it. It seems fundamentally that his family is still in the position that assumes that him making sacrifices is the natural expectation, and they eventually move out and give him up at the end of the story. So the next story I'm going to talk about is called A Report to the Academy. It is about an ape reporting to like what he called the esteemed academicians. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that word. I don't know what to put like the stress, like academicians, whatever. Let's just call them academics or something. So these people like taught him how to act like a human, and in turn he kind of says, oh, this is a report and I'm going to tell of my process of learning. And it's really interesting here where he says, I had no desire to imitate humans. I imitated them because I was looking for a way out of my predicament. I learned, oh, if you have to learn, you learn. If you're desperate for a way out, you learn. You learn pitilessly. You stand over yourself with a whip in your hand. If there's the least resistance, you lash yourself. So it really reminds me when Benjamin kind of talked about Kafka's idea of we act like a human, like people assimilate into society by trying to act like how other people act, even though the gestures themselves may carry little like expression of authenticity or meaning, but we're all just like acting like each other. Anyways, the last of Kafka's story that I will discuss is called Josefine the Singer, or The Mouse People. So this is about a singer called Josephine, whose songs are like the most divine and unparalleled by anyone in this imaginary realm of a story. Although the people acknowledge her status and her influence on them, they do not truly understand her music. Like they don't really understand the mechanisms and how to like most appropriately, suitably, best appreciate it. She knows that they do not understand, and for this reason she treats herself as innately superior to them. However, in fact, they do not really respect or value her greatly, even though they know that her music has like so much great worth and a lot of influence over the people. For example, when she threatens to change her singing due to the fact that they do not excuse her from like manual labor, the reaction is, the people disregard all these announcements and decisions and revised decisions just like an adult disregards the chatter of a child, in a spirit of mingled benevolence and unconcern. I think in the story rings a really prominent theme in many of Kafka's stories, which is someone who seems to have a very important role in family or society turns out not to be valued at all. And it's really emphasizing the idea that in modern society, no one is unique and everyone is just replaceable in the structure of society, no matter how important you are. Like, you're not valued as a person, but just as a placeholder for certain like important roles. The next book I'm going to discuss is called The Concept of Law by H.L.A. Hart. So this is one of the most foundational texts in legal philosophy and jurisprudence. I'm reading it because of my personal interest in this area, and also like because of my extended essays. I said one of them is kind of about legal justice. And it's like this book and my essay sort of like an intersection between philosophy and law, even though this book isn't directly linked to the specific issue I'm discussing. I just felt like it's interesting background, I might as well read it. So I'm not an expert in this area, obviously. So I will mainly just be sharing some interesting points that I found in the book about legal theory, and it's mainly just like, well, I didn't really think of that before, I didn't know that before, and I'm about halfway through the book, so I'll be just sharing up to now what I've read. So one of the main points raised by Hart in this book is he is critiquing the conventional interpretation of law as orders backed by threats. And I found his arguments against it quite enlightening. So firstly, he notes a circularity problem. So if the rule is interpreted as saying, if you do X, you will receive a punishment, then for the judge in punishing, takes the rule as his guide and the breach of the rule as his reason and justification for punishing the offender. He does not look upon the rule as a statement that he and others are likely to punish deviations. It's circular because you can't say the rule is, oh, if you do X, you will receive punishment, because when the judge punishes people, he's using the rule itself as justification, so it doesn't work out. And secondly, the theory of law as coercive orders meets at the outset with the objection that there are varieties of law found in all systems which, in three principal respects, do not fit this description. First, even a penal statute, which comes nearest to it, has a range of applications different from that of orders given to others. And secondly, other statutes are unlike orders in that they do not require persons to do things but may confer powers on them. They do not impose duties but offer facilities for the free creation of legal rights and duties within the coercive framework of the law. It's like, for example, the law allows you to marry someone, to have a contractual obligation established between you and another person. It's not an order backed by threats. It's kind of like a right or a liberty or whatever granted to you. And then there's a third point, which is, though the enactment of a statute is in some ways analogous to the giving of an order, some rules of law originate in custom and do not owe their legal status to any such conscious law-creating act. And also, one interesting point that he raised when discussing legislation or sovereign power is a constitution which effectively restricts the legislative powers of the supreme legislature in the system does not need to do so by imposing duties on the legislature not to attempt to legislate in certain ways. Instead, it provides that any such purported legislation shall be void. It imposes not legal duties but legal disabilities. Limit here implies not the presence of duty but the absence of legal power. Another key role of the law is providing limits on what is actually within versus without the concern of law, and this is more than just specifying what is taken as legal versus illegal, i.e. deserving of punishment. And another key feature of any legal system that is rather enlightening that Hart notes is that it has to be divided into primary and secondary rules. So basically we have primary rules we understand as just naturally what you can do, what you can't do, etc. But secondary rules are different. They are to be said to be about such rules in the sense that while primary rules are concerned with the actions that individuals must or must not do, the secondary rules are all concerned with the primary rules themselves. They specify the ways in which the primary rules may be conclusively ascertained, introduced, eliminated, varied, and the fact of their violation conclusively determined. So the the topic of jurisprudence focuses more on secondary rules because it is a discussion on how we should implement the primary rules, an assessment of whether they're just and fair, and just more theoretical things. The last book I'm going to introduce this video is called Dr. Zhivago by Pasternak. Yes, it's a big book. I wanted to begin it for a long time, but I literally have this mortal dread of big books. I finally made the decision to start it last month, and so far I'm really slowly treading through it. But I quite enjoy it. It's a typical Russian big family saga story. So it was a bit fragmented and hard to follow in the beginning when all the characters were being introduced, and in the beginning their storylines haven't really intersected with each other, so it was a bit difficult. But around 40-ish pages into it, I got really into it. So right now I'm around a fourth into the book, and I found the heroine Lara really interesting, in particular because of her treatment of her complex relationship and feelings for Komarovsky, this wealthy man who's her benefactor but also abusing her in a sexual relationship, and Pasha, who she's in love with and she later marries. So let me read this excerpt. Now she's his slave for life. Is it his age, Mama's financial dependence on him, his skills on frightening her? No, that's all nonsense. It's not she who's subordinate to him, but he to her. Doesn't she see how he languishes after her? It is he who should be ashamed and frightened if she should expose him. But the thing is that she will never do it, for that she does not have enough baseness, which is Komarovsky's main strength in dealing with the subordinate and weak. I think this passage is a brilliant illumination of a typical relationship between a young, powerless but attractive girl to a much more powerful man. And this really reminds me of a lot of people blaming the victim when young girls get involved with much older, powerful men, sugar daddies or stuff, and they're just voluntary, you walked into it, you have the power to walk out. But it turns out, even if it seems like the older man is really obsessed with the younger woman and she could have a high degree of control over him, it's not necessarily the case. So it is quite complex. And I think besides her relationship, she's also given like a high level of personal complexity. So it's really hard at this early stage, only 14 into the book, to describe accurately what kind of person I really think she is. But I should try to say that she's someone who strives for material independence, but simultaneously needs people to like cling onto as a form of emotional dependence. So, but the thing is, it's really hard for her to have material independence and emotional dependence at the same time. And material dependence on other people gives her anxiety. So for example, when she lived as a dependent ward with the Kologrovovs' family, Lara considered her position false and untenable. It seemed to her that she was a burden to them all, and they simply did not show it. She seemed to see signs of negligence in everything. If the Kologrovovs' visiting acquaintances made much of her, it meant they were treating her as an uncomplaining ward and easy prey. But when she was left in peace, it proved that she was a non-entity, and they did not notice her. And there's also a really like revealing passage of her relationship to her husband Pasha from his perspective. Doesn't he understand that she loved not him but her noble task in relation to him, her exploit personified? So it's really the case that she just needs some sort of person object for her to emotionally throw onto, like throw her emotions and like lean herself onto. And that is kind of something that's really dragging her down, bothering her despite her desire for material independence. So here's a summary for my October and November reading. Although I haven't read much in quantity, I really try to go over them in depth and in detail, and I hope that this video has inspired some of your interest to try out any of the books that I've mentioned here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like my video, and I'll be really grateful for any comments.